somebody not obeying the strategies we've been talking about and say they have a big bolus of glucose or carbohydrates. Let's take that story even further and what happens with insulin in the body and how we put on weight and the other problems when we spike glucose and insulin.
Yeah, it actually goes much further than weight gain. Unfortunately, insulin, when it gets too high, affects every single organ system. So I wrote about this in the diabetes code. And the whole problem is that if you have insulin moves the glucose into the cells, right? If it's chronically high, so if you have too much insulin, you're going to gain a lot of weight because you're moving a lot of glucose into the cells. The cells are going to store it as body fat. But more than that, they're going to fill up so that the glucose can no longer go in the cell because the cell is full. So the glucose is going to spill out of the cell, which is called type 2 diabetes. So you can store energy in the form of either sugar or fat. And you have too much fat, that's obesity. When you have too much sugar, it's diabetes. And diabetes raises your risk of virtually every problem we know. So heart disease, strokes, cancers, infections, kidney disease, blindness, amputations. Pretty much you name it, diabetes makes it worse. So therefore, it's actually a very, very critical player in this whole thing. And it's all driven by the hyperinsulinemia that we've been getting. So all of these diseases, the type 2 diabetes and obesity, they're basically both diseases of hyperinsulinemia, as is PCOS and certain other diseases that we find. But the insulin is, and it's not, again, it's not that insulin is a bad hormone. Any hormone that is excessively high is bad, like hyperthyroidism. You have too much thyroid hormone, right? You could have too much growth hormone. That's gigantism, right? You could have too much estrogen, too much testosterone. Like it goes on and on. These are natural hormones, but when that level is excessively high, then that becomes a problem. And how does it become excessively high? Well, with natural foods, it generally doesn't because you activate these natural satiety hormones. So with natural foods, you stop eating at some point, right? You eat steak, you stop at some point because you get full, right? It activates GLP-1 and other satiety hormones, peptide YY, cholecystokinin. It's when you start to see all these ultra-processed foods that get around the satiety mechanism, right? They take say the white bread, they take away the protein, they take away the fat, they pulverize it into a fine dust. They add texturizers and emulsifiers so it just melts in your mouth. Like a loaf of Wonder Bread or whatever is soft for like a week and a half, right? Now compare that to a loaf of bread that you would buy at a bakery, which doesn't contain all this chemicals. It's rock hard the next day. It's like you get a sourdough loaf. The next day, it's rock hard. That's what it's supposed to be. But all those chemicals keep it soft. But that generates the mouthfeel, the texture that's going to keep you eating. And you're going to keep eating it because, it stimulates pleasure. It's absorbed so quickly. You get this big spike of dopamine. So you get this hedonic hunger that gets generated, right? So there's a whole cascade to even beyond the homeostatic hunger, which is a huge topic by itself. You've got these other types because if you start overeating these sort of these ultra processed foods, then you can overcome any signals from the homeostatic side, which says, hey, you're full, but then you can't stop, right? And that's the whole problem.
A big part of the messaging in the new book is to get rid of these ultra processed foods. How often do you find that's enough? Because the other lever we can pull is to greatly bring the carbs down or get rid of them.
Yeah.
So talk about working with patients over the years. How often do you need to go more drastic and actually bring the carbs down versus just get rid of these foods that are basically made in a lab?
Yeah, essentially 70% of the American diet is ultra processed foods. And that becomes a problem because, more of what we eat is ultra processed than not. So if you can bring somebody back to, reasonable levels. So you look at other countries like Italy and stuff, they're like 20, 25%, right? And Italians, they love their food. They're famous for loving food, right? But there's not that much obesity. Why? Because they're not eating the ultra processed foods. They're eating the foods, enjoying them, but then they stop because they're natural foods. They don't have this thing where they keep popping in the cheese puffs, and don't stop. And so you sit in front of the TV. You initially were not hungry. Now you're hungry because of the conditioned hunger. But then you've got the hedonic hunger because this is a very processed, highly ultra processed food with lots of, chemicals and artificial flavors and artificial colors, right? And then you're just popping it, right? So most of the time, if you can get down to a pretty low level of ultra processed foods, you're going to do most of the work. Sometimes you do have to dramatically, especially if you're way overweight or your insulin levels are very high, you have to go further and dramatically lower the carbohydrates or add the fasting, which is, of course, zero of everything, right? So that's another lever to pull. The point is that how people gain weight is very individual. Like there's, I list in the book like 10 different ways you can affect digestion, 10 different ways you can affect absorption, and like 12 different hormones. That's like 1,000 different causes of weight gain, right? And if somebody has a food addiction to ultra processed foods, for example, then you have to say, yes, the ultra processed foods has to go. You don't necessarily need to cut the carbs, right? And this is the problem with the whole calories argument, because they dumb it down to every single problem is a calorie problem, just like every single alcoholic drinks too much alcohol. Yes, I get that, but why, right? The whole thing is that, for them, to the man with a hammer, every problem is a nail, right? So it's like, hey, your problem is ultra processed foods. Eat fewer calories. It's like, what? That's not the solution. If your problem is ultra processed food, eat less ultra processed foods. If your problem is you're not getting enough sleep and therefore you're stress eating, right? The answer is not eat fewer calories. The answer is get more sleep. Like, isn't that obvious? Why would you use this hammer for a problem that's not a nail, right? If your problem is that you're, eating too many carbohydrates, then it's not eating fewer calories, it's eating fewer carbohydrates. If your problem is that you're eating because you have all this food noise, this conditioned hunger, then deal with that. Figure out how you're going to deal with that. And in the book, I talk about different strategies for conditioned hunger, for hedonic hunger, including things like mindfulness and, gratitude. And, there's a whole different mindsets. There's a whole different toolkit that you have to use when you have these other problems, not just eat fewer calories. That makes no sense at all.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Different foods stimulate different levels of insulin. What's insulin's job? Well, to tell you to store more body fat. If it's chronically high, you're going to gain a lot of weight because you're moving a lot of glucose into the cells. They're going to fill up so that glucose